In the blistering heat of a military hangar, where jet engines hum and secrets linger, a woman with a scarred shoulder tightens bolts in silence, her past buried beneath years of grease and grit. Eden Wolf, mocked as Granny by young airmen, carries a wound that whispers of a night 17 years ago, a night of blood, courage, and a mission the world forgot. When a general's gaze locks onto her scar, a single moment shatters the silence, pulling us into a story of hidden heroism, unspoken pain, and a truth that demands to be heard. What scars do you carry that no one sees? Join us as we uncover Eden's journey, where every wrench turn and every heartbeat reveals the strength of a soul that refused to stay invisible. The wrench didn't so much as twitch. Even as sweat ran down Eden Wolf's temple and the harsh sun beat down on the back of her neck, her grip held steady. Her hands moved with a silent rhythm beneath the belly of a training jet, tightening a new valve, checking each bolt with the calm confidence of someone who knew every curve of the machine like her own bones. Across the hangar, voices rose. "Somebody tell Granny her shoulder's leaking." "Oh, wait, never mind, that's just her burn." Laughter rippled through the space, sharp, immature. Four young airmen, barely past 20, stood a few feet away, pretending to not look at her directly. One exaggerated a limp, the other clutched his shoulder, grinning like he'd made the joke of the year. Eden didn't respond. She didn't flinch or even glance at them. She slid deeper under the aircraft, one hand bracing the socket wrench, the other swiping sweat from her brow. The scar on her shoulder caught the light, a brutal, crude stitch line that cut from her collarbone down to her tricep. A battlefield mark, ugly to some, unmistakable to others. For her, it was never about appearance. It was survival etched into flesh. "Bet she welded that valve using a walker," one muttered. "Nah, probably summoned the ghost of Nam for backup," another chimed in. These weren't new insults. Eden had been stationed at this base for 6 years. The boys rotated in and out, full of fresh arrogance and empty experience. Every cycle, a few couldn't help themselves, mocking her age, her silence, the scar she wore like a flag she never raised. She let them. Attention brought questions. Questions reached too far into the past. Eden finished the repair, ran her hand along the clean seam of the aircraft, then tapped a button on the diagnostic tablet. Green light, all clear. No leaks, no errors. She slid out from under the jet, stood slowly, her knees creaking as they straightened. The laughter around her began to die down. One airman gave a final snort, but even that faded. Across the tarmac, a convoy of black SUVs rolled to a halt. The base commander stepped out with stiff posture, hand raised in salute as the passenger door opened. Out stepped a man whose presence drew silence like a tide pulling back. Silver hair, sharp eyes, and the weight of 4 stars on his chest. General Ransom Locke. No one had expected him. The surprise inspection sent a ripple of unease through the senior staff. Whispers bloomed, talk of audits, readiness checks, possible reassignment. None of it touched Eden. She grabbed her tablet and walked toward the rear tool cart, not noticing the way the general had stopped, not hearing the words that left his lips like a revelation. "Who is that mechanic?" he asked, his voice low. The base commander turned. "Sergeant Eden Wolf, sir." But Ransom wasn't listening. His eyes had locked onto the scar across her shoulder. The rest, salutes, formalities, briefing folders, disappeared into static. Because 17 years ago, in the steaming black of a jungle battlefield, he had seen that exact stitch pattern. On a night when blood soaked through his uniform, when pain turned the world red, and the only thing that anchored him to life were the steady hands of a medic who never spoke, never removed her helmet, and vanished into the dark before dawn. He'd never seen her face. Until now, Eden felt the change in the air, the subtle pause. She turned slowly, her gaze meeting his for the first time in nearly 2 decades. His mouth parted slightly, then closed again. She gave him a nod, brief, professional, the kind used between soldiers during extractions under fire. That was enough. The murmurs that followed didn't come from the airmen. They came from the officers. Why's the general looking at her like that? Did she even salute? Is he walking toward her? Ransom crossed the tarmac. The base commander hustled behind him, trying to keep up. Eden set down her tablet, expression calm. Sergeant Wolf, the commander began. The general raised a hand. Silence. He stopped just in front of her, gaze flicking once more to the scar before locking eyes with hers. Do you remember Nighthawk 17? He asked quietly. Eden's response didn't come right away. She let it hang in the air for a moment. Then she said, Code Red, Extraction Point Delta, Mission Clock, 2:43. Ransom exhaled slowly. She remembered everything. You never said your name, he said. You weren't supposed to. But you saved mine. Eden didn't reply. Behind them, the laughter had long stopped. The officers said nothing. The young airmen stared in stunned silence. Ransom glanced back, then turned to her again. I owe you. You don't? Eden replied, voice calm. Not anymore. And just like that, she turned away. Walked to the far end of the hangar, where another jet waited for maintenance. The general didn't follow. He stood still as the wind picked up, rustling papers and caps. For the first time in 17 years, Eden Wolf didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. No one approached her for the rest of the day, not a whisper, not a smirk. The 4 airmen who jeered earlier avoided her completely. That suited her just fine. The burden of silence she'd carried for nearly 2 decades never truly left her. But in that moment, the scar they used to mock had spoken louder than any defense she could have offered. By sunset, Eden had finished the second jet. She completed her checklists, logged the diagnostics, and returned her tools. Her joints ached with every movement, but she didn't voice it. She never did. She stepped out into the late golden light, pulled off her gloves, and tucked them into her back pocket. She was almost to her car when a young uniformed aide jogged up, breathing hard. Ma'am, he panted, the general requests your presence. Briefing room 2. Now. Eden looked at him for a moment, then gave a single nod. Inside, the briefing room was cool and sterile. General Locke stood alone, arms crossed, staring at an old mission dossier displayed on the digital wall. You came, he said. I wasn't given a choice. A flicker of a smile tugged at his mouth. Still the same. You talk just enough. Eden stepped closer. Her eyes scanned the glowing screen. The mission code, Nighthawk 17, redacted names, satellite overlays, GPS timestamps. Most of it still classified. They never released this, she said. I pulled it from a deep archive, Ransom replied. Had to pull strings to get clearance. Haven't touched this file in years, but the second I saw your scar, my memory knew. Just needed proof. Eden folded her arms. So what now, she asked. You want a debrief after 17 years? Enough to override safety settings. Her jaw tightened. This wasn't a malfunction. It was sabotage. She moved fast but silent, her fingers flying across the terminal keys. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. The override was buried beneath layers of standard code, disguised as an error correction patch. Only someone who understood the system's quirks, its ghost lines and bypass habits, could have hidden it this well. By the time the sun crept over the horizon, Eden had already locked the maintenance logs behind encrypted access and sent a quiet red flag alert to General Locke. Then, without waiting, she rolled her tool cart toward the tarmac, head down, sleeves rolled, expression flat. She wasn't going to let whoever did this get a second chance. Across the flight line, Travis and Bennett spotted her. They didn't call out, just fell into step behind her like they'd been trained to. She didn't glance back, but she knew they were there, and that was enough. Inside the hangar, she rechecked every hydraulic and pressure system, walked the entire length of the fuselage, then crawled under the frame with a flashlight between her teeth. Fuel lines intact, cooling system clean, sensor brackets tight. But near the aft coupling, she found it. A tiny, almost imperceptible heat weld, fresh and poorly done. She reached for her scope and confirmed it. Someone had tried to bypass the emergency shutdown circuit. It wouldn't have triggered unless the plane hit altitude. Then it would have failed hard. Eden's pulse hammered, but her face remained still. She slid back out and stood slowly, wiping her hands on her coveralls. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't a mistake. Someone wanted that plane to crash. Someone who knew exactly how she worked. Her mind raced. She could feel old ghosts rising. Derek Voss. It had his signature all over it. Crude finesse wrapped in enough plausible deniability to slip through normal checks. But he was supposed to be out. Discharged. Done. She stormed into the office beside Hangar 12, bypassed the logbook, and tapped into the base's access records. Generic tech ID, 3 hours before shift, log in from Terminal 5. She cross-referenced surveillance timestamps. Fuzzy footage. Cap pulled low. But the walk, the posture, it was him. Voss. She sent the still image to Locke with a single word. Confirmed. By noon, base security was already sweeping. Voss was nowhere to be found. That night, Edney didn't sleep. She stayed on the hangar floor, triple-checking every line, every valve, every latch. The other techs noticed, but no one interrupted. Even Lucas, usually full of questions, just left a thermos of coffee by her elbow and backed away quietly. By morning, the official investigation had begun. Eden sat across from military police, calm and precise. She gave times, coordinates, access paths. Not emotion, facts. That was how you stayed clean, how you stayed useful. Locke met her in the hallway afterward. His face was drawn, older than it had looked yesterday. "We'll get him." Eden nodded once. "Just make sure it's before another plane goes down." Locke paused, then reached into his coat pocket. "The Pentagon still wants that debrief. Your statement started something." "I didn't ask to start anything," she said, but her voice was softer this time. "No," Locke said, "you didn't. But people are listening now, and they're asking the right questions." She looked away, out toward the flight line where dawn was breaking and the silhouettes of aircraft sat like sleeping giants. "Then let's give them the right answers, but on our terms." A week later, Lena Marquez arrived at the base. She came with a small camera crew and a worn leather journal. Lucas had mailed her scans of Eden's technical drawings and field notes, and she traced them back to Hangar 12. She didn't ask for interviews at first, just watched. Followed Eden's movements. She watched how Maria took charge of inventory, how Lucas cross-checked his sketches with live systems. She watched Eden pause over each trainee's work, wordless but watchful. Only on the third day did Lena approach her. No camera, just a quiet conversation over the wing of a fighter jet. "You're not what they expected," she said. "I'm not here to meet expectations." "No," Lena replied. "You're here to fix what they broke." Eden didn't smile, but she didn't walk away either. The documentary released 3 months later. It wasn't flashy, no reenactments, no slow-mo shots or swelling music, just raw interviews, background data, scanned reports, and Eden's voice woven in through clips of her statement. It was called Ghost Tech, The Woman Who Stayed. The response was overwhelming. Military academies added it to their ethics modules. Veterans wrote in from all over the world. The hashtag #FixLikeEden trended for nearly a week. Still, she kept to her work. She didn't go to premieres. She didn't answer press. When someone left a medal at her workstation, an unofficial replica of the one she'd refused 17 years ago, she placed it inside a sealed toolbox and never opened it again. Because for Eden Wolf, the story wasn't about heroism or recognition. It was about doing the job, keeping someone alive, and never letting anyone forget what silence really meant. Iden had noticed the signs, just subtle enough to go overlooked, but precise enough to be intentional. The pressure readouts had been tampered with, clearance logs falsified. This wasn't negligence. It was sabotage. But without hard proof, she kept silent. Instead, she pulled the jet offline and one panel at a time began to disassemble it herself. For hours, she worked in the dim hangar, hands steady and patient. Then she found it, an old-school trick, a method familiar to anyone trained well enough in sabotage. A hydraulic latch had been partially loosened, carefully hidden beneath the intake panel, and masked with fresh sealant, just convincing enough to pass a routine inspection, but deadly enough to cause a failure mid-flight. She crouched back on her heels, breathing quietly, eyes fixed on the mechanism. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing, and they'd wanted her to find it. Eden resealed the panel, logged the fault through standard channels, deliberately leaving out the sabotage. Then she turned to surveillance. The camera near Bay 3 had been wiped. intentionally. Only a wide-angle backup remained, grainy and distorted. But in the blurry footage, a single silhouette stood out. Broad shoulders, cropped hair, no clear ID, but her instincts were already narrowing it down. That night, she stayed late. She made it seem like she was running calibration again. Just another long shift. But she wasn't calibrating anything. She was waiting. At 2200 hours, just as she suspected, someone slipped into Hangar 12 through the side hatch. Eden didn't say a word. She stepped from the shadows and switched on the overhead light. Travis froze mid-step. The young airman looked like a child caught with his hand in the wrong drawer. His guilt unmistakable. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he stammered. "I just thought if something seemed off, they'd pull you off the line. Put someone else in charge." "Why?" Eden's voice was low, calm. He dropped his gaze to the concrete. "Because you made us all feel like idiots. Like I'd never catch up to you." Eden didn't answer. She let the silence press in around them. "But I didn't touch the latch," Travis added quickly. "I swear, I only changed the readouts. Just the numbers. I never touched the jet." She believed him. He wasn't trained for that kind of trick, which meant someone else was involved. Someone with skill, experience, and access. Someone still watching. The next morning, Eden went straight to General Ransom Locke. She laid it all out. The suspicious fault, Travis's confession, the erased surveillance. His expression hardened as he listened. "I'll open an investigation," Locke said. Quiet. Internal. "No," Eden interrupted, eyes locked onto his. "Not quiet." He held her gaze for a beat. She added, "Whoever did this counted on silence. They expected the system to protect them. I've already been buried once. I'm not letting that happen again." Locke gave a slow nod. Within 48 hours, the base commander signed off on a full audit of all maintenance access. Eden was granted temporary oversight. Her badge now bore a red seal, an override designation directly from the Pentagon. Most people on base had never even seen that symbol before. Whispers started again, but this time they didn't mock her, they warned of her. She began digging through the logs, combing through weeks of data. She cross-referenced timestamps, movements, signatures. A pattern emerged, minor tampering on 3 aircraft, spaced out just enough to avoid drawing attention. It had been happening for weeks. Then came the break. A login from a technician's ID. Only that sergeant had been dead for 6 years. Stolen credentials. Eden requested encrypted access to deeper personnel archives. She cross-referenced against former tech crew discharged for misconduct. One name surfaced, Derek Voss, a former weapons systems mechanic. Brilliant, bitter, dishonorably discharged, and now, somehow, recontracted as a civilian consultant under a false identity. He'd been on base the whole time. Eden opened his personnel file and felt her stomach knot. Among the redacted records was a single mission code. Nighthawk 17. She knew it instantly. Her past wasn't coming back. It was already here, walking the same halls. That night, Eden barely slept. She sat at the edge of her cot in the cramped barracks, sipping bitter instant coffee from a chipped mug, staring at Voss's file until his name blurred on the screen. His records were a mosaic of blacked-out lines, but she could still see the shape of the truth, Nighthawk 17. She hadn't heard those words in years, not since the jungle, not since the fire and smoke and blood. Not since she'd held Locke's life in her hands as he flatlined for 43 seconds, her makeshift chest tube sealed with 3 zip ties and a cracked stylus. Now she remembered Voss, not from the mission itself, but from the prep. Back then, he was sharp, competitive, impulsive, too reckless. He hadn't made it past the second phase and had been scrubbed without explanation. Eden hadn't asked why. Now she didn't need to. She closed the file. Morning was hours away, but she had one more thing to do. She changed into civilian clothes, slipped the red-sealed badge into her boot, and walked alone beneath the half-lit stars. She crossed the base compound and entered an old, forgotten hangar. One she shouldn't have had access to, except the red seal opened every door. It took her 40 minutes to find what she was looking for, a sealed crate labeled defective. Inside was a backup server from Nighthawk 17's command pod, supposedly unused. She plugged it into a shielded terminal. The interface lit up. A voice log surfaced, scrambled, fragmented, but recoverable. Override authorization. Voss. Kilo Delta zero 07. She played it twice. Then she called General Locke. He arrived 20 minutes later, out of uniform, jaw set tight. Eden didn't speak. She handed him the headset. He listened. Then he looked at her and said, "We bring it forward." She nodded. By noon, the Pentagon had been briefed. That night, Derek Voss was taken into custody. But it didn't stop there. Within 72 hours, the Voss investigation was leaked to the press. Not the sabotage, but his ties to Eden and the Nighthawks teen mission. Conspiracy theories exploded across the net. Threads claiming the woman who faked a war medal or deep state engineer behind military failures surged into public discourse. The base shifted again. Not all of them, but enough. The whispers returned. This time they weren't respectful. They were suspicious. The red seal on Eden's badge had become a target. Some muttered that she'd staged everything herself, sabotaged the aircraft to paint herself as a hero. Even the young airmen, the ones who once looked up to her, began hesitating when she spoke. It wasn't betrayal, just fear. Then came the hearing. An internal board convened. No courtroom, no formal charges, just a room with cold lighting and clear intentions. They wanted it quiet again. They wanted her buried. She arrived in her old uniform, one that hadn't seen sunlight in over 10 years. No medals, no ribbons, just the faded falcon patch on her left sleeve and the scar beneath it, visible and unhidden. 6 officers sat on the panel, 3 she recognized, 1 she didn't. And then General Locke entered last, taking the final chair at the end. She answered every question, calm, direct, unafraid. She explained the sabotage, presented the logs, withheld nothing. Then the chairwoman leaned forward. "Do you deny leveraging your past for current influence?" Eden stared at her. "I denied my past for 17 years, and no one cared." The silence that followed was thick and long. And then General Locke did something no one expected. He stood, walked to the center of the room, turned between investigator and outcast. Though she held authorization from the Pentagon itself, the air around her was thick with skepticism. Some questioned her presence outright. Others offered only tight-lipped greetings, their gazes flicking to the metal on her chest as if weighing its legitimacy. But Eden didn't flinch. She worked late into the nights, her hands deep in grease and wiring, her eyes scanning every line of code, every bolt and fuse. What she uncovered was a deliberate act, not crude sabotage, but precise, practiced. Someone had altered the diagnostic protocols on several targeting systems, causing malfunctions that could have been catastrophic. It wasn't a random act of dissent. It was a message. Eden documented everything, cross-referenced data, and compiled a detailed report. But as she prepared to submit it, an encrypted message arrived from an unknown source. "Stop digging. This isn't your war anymore." Eden stared at the message for a long time. She didn't reply. Instead, she made 3 copies of her report, one for Central Command, one for the Pentagon liaison, and one she left sealed with the base commander. She handed it over without explanation. "If anything happens to me," she said quietly, "send this through the chain of command. Bypass local protocols." The commander's eyes narrowed. He nodded once. That night, Eden returned to her quarters to find her gear ransacked. Nothing was missing, but everything had been touched. A warning, not a theft. The next morning, she boarded a transport out without ceremony. As the aircraft lifted off, the desert base grew smaller beneath her, its secrets buried beneath layers of sand, machinery, and silence. Back home, the program pushed forward. Reforms were slowly adopted, some more reluctantly than others. The anonymous letters continued, more subtle now, but still sharp-edged. Despite the resistance, Eden's presence galvanized others. Lucas, her young protege with a notebook full of diagrams and questions, launched a proposal for a mobile unit, survival tech specialists who could deploy rapidly to field bases. Maria took over Eden's training sessions at the main base, her confidence steady, her voice strong. Kelly, the once hesitant airman, now led a maintenance crew of her own. She sent Eden a photo, her team surrounding a freshly repaired jet, grease on their hands, pride in their eyes. "We're not perfect," the caption read, "but we're here, every damn day." Eden smiled when she saw it. Then she turned her attention to a new request, an invitation to consult on an international coalition's survival tech initiative. It meant broader reach, more travel, and a chance to standardize training across allied forces. But it also meant stepping deeper into a system still struggling to evolve. Before she departed, she visited Ray's diner. Miguel was there, wiping down the counter, as always. A few regulars lifted their coffee mugs in quiet salute. The back room had changed again. More photos, more letters pinned to the wall. One frame held a worn patch from a pilot's flight suit. The corner burned, the fabric frayed. Underneath it, someone had written in black marker, "She pulled us out. We remember." Miguel slid a cup toward her. "Still just black?" Eden nodded. "Still just black." He poured without another word. The silence between them was easy, earned. Later that evening, as she packed her bag for yet another deployment, Eden placed the Distinguished Service Medal, not on her uniform, but in a drawer. Her scar was still there, the skin puckered and pale against her shoulder. But she didn't cover it anymore. It wasn't shame, it was story. And stories, she had learned, could be louder than anything else. Louder than silence, louder than doubt, louder than the entire machine of military tradition when wielded by those who refused to be erased. She walked out into the night, not seeking applause or redemption, but ready, again, to do the work that mattered. The next chapter was calling, and Eden Wolf answered. Eden Wolf had become more than just a technical expert. She was now a quiet but unwavering force of change, a detective of faults and a calm in the storm. Her days were filled with equal parts strategy and compassion, steering her survival tech program through skepticism and resistance. One evening, as she hunched over streams of diagnostic data under the muted glow of her quarters, a hesitant knock came at the door. Lieutenant Carter stood just outside, posture stiff, voice low. "Sergeant Wolf," he said cautiously, "you should hear this. There's been talk. Resistance to your program. Some are saying it undermines the chain of command." Eden didn't flinch. Her face remained composed, unreadable. "Any advice?" he asked after a pause, uncertain. "Listen more than you speak," she replied quietly. "Earn trust through what you do, not what you say. And remember, change doesn't come from issuing orders. It's earned through respect." The days that followed were difficult. Eden walked into a landscape where progress was met with veiled resistance. Delayed paperwork, contradictory reports, passive-aggressive warnings hidden beneath layers of military decorum. But she was no stranger to pressure, and amid the shadow play she discovered allies. Pilots who remembered her courage in combat, young technicians moved by her relentless dedication, and even commanders who knew that growth often came hand in hand with discomfort. Eventually, the sabotage was confirmed. The perpetrator, Derek Voss, a former contractor with a history of disrupting operations, was identified and dealt with. The morale of the base, though shaken, slowly began to recover. Before leaving the installation, Eden addressed the assembly in the hangar bay. Her voice rang out with calm strength. "Every scar we carry, whether you see it or not, tells a story of survival. Our strength doesn't come from avoiding pain. It comes from how we rebuild, how we move forward. This program isn't here to replace anyone. It's here so we can rise together, stronger, smarter, united." Nods spread through the room. Some were cautious, others resolute. But the tide had shifted. When she returned home, Ray's diner greeted her with a familiar warmth. But something had changed. The honor wall had grown, now a patchwork of faces and names from veterans across the country. Stories of hardship, of triumph, of loss. Miguel stood behind the counter, arms folded, a knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Looks like you're making waves." Eden smiled back, her voice soft. "Ripples," she said. "Waves take time." Later that night, after the last chair had been flipped and the lights dimmed, Eden sat by the window. Outside, the city pulsed with quiet life, its lights flickering like distant stars. Her scar, long healed but never forgotten, caught the glow, part memory, part promise. She touched it lightly. The mission wasn't over. It had simply evolved. Her work had begun to ripple outward, The survival tech training program had become a beacon for those who felt unseen, unheard. But with that visibility came new challenges. The support it drew was matched by mounting opposition, slow, silent, bureaucratic. One early morning, Eden returned to base and noticed something under her door. A letter. No return address. Typed, clean, watch your back. Not everyone wants you here. She folded the note carefully and tucked it away. Threats didn't rattle her. Not anymore. Her shoulder bore the permanent reminder of what resistance could cost. Her days became a tightrope act, fighting for reform while shielding herself and the young people who placed their hope in her. She coordinated closely with legal teams and base security to safeguard the integrity of her program. It was exhausting work, but it mattered. Amid the stress, light still found its way through. One afternoon, a young technician named Lucas nervously approached her, a frayed journal clutched in his arms. Inside were technical drawings, maintenance notes, and reflections scribbled in the margins. His thoughts on persistence, discipline, and the future. "I've been following your work," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "This program, it changed the way I see myself." Eden flipped through the pages with quiet admiration, then closed the journal and pressed a small badge into his hand. "Keep this," she said. "You're part of this now." Moments like that gave her the strength to keep going. She began speaking at military academies, community centers, anywhere people needed to hear the stories that lived in the margins of official records. Stories of survival, stories like her own. But the resistance didn't rest. Rumors spread of budget cuts targeting her program. Memos circulated questioning its value. And one evening in the middle of a senior strategy session, a high-ranking official confronted her. "Sergeant Wolf," he said bluntly, "your story is compelling, but it's anecdotal. We need results. Can you guarantee this program won't become a resource sink with little operational return?" Eden didn't blink. "I can guarantee it will save lives on and off the battlefield. And I can guarantee that ignoring resilience costs far more than anyone wants to admit." The room went still. No one responded. They didn't need to. Later that night, walking the hushed corridors of the base, Eden allowed herself a moment of reflection. This wasn't just about courage. It was about endurance. Weeks later, an independent report landed on her desk. Objective, data-driven. The findings were clear. Reduced maintenance errors, better equipment readiness, and a noticeable uptick in technician retention. Some critics quieted, but Eden understood that the numbers, while important, were only half the war. The real battle was cultural. At Ray's Diner one evening, a group of veterans gathered. They spoke in low tones of loneliness, shame, and the steep, silent cliffs of post-service life. Eden didn't speak at first. She just listened. And when she did speak, it wasn't as a leader or reformer, but as one of them. "We carry wounds the world doesn't see," she said, "but they're no less real. Our strength isn't in medals or scars. It's in standing together and refusing to disappear." The applause was soft but deeply felt. That night, locking the door behind her, Eden paused. The weight of legacy pressed gently on her shoulders. But so did hope. The mission was still alive, only now it burned brighter, deeper, harder. The days that followed tested her like never before. The survival tech program was gaining momentum, shifting culture in slow, meaningful ways. But with every stride forward came backlash, some subtle, some brazen. One morning, a package appeared at Ray's. Inside was a photograph, a close-up of her scar circled in red. Beneath it, a handwritten message. "We're watching." Eden's jaw clenched. She took the photo straight to General Ransom Locke. He didn't hesitate. Security protocols were increased immediately. But the threat had evolved. This wasn't just opposition anymore. It was personal. Still, she pressed on. She expanded the program's reach, collaborating with veterans groups, psychologists, family advocates. Survival tech was no longer just physical. It became emotional too. Workshops in mental health and peer counseling grew alongside engine diagnostics and field mechanics. During one of those sessions, Eden met Murray, a former combat medic battling PTSD and the invisible fractures of reintegration. Their conversations cracked something open in Eden. Survival, she realized, wasn't about machines or manuals. It was about people, about spirit, about holding on. Meanwhile, a quiet storm was building within the ranks of her opposition. A whistleblowers had surfaced, and the documents they brought forward were about to change everything. The leak exposed layers of corruption and resistance embedded within the system, attempts to sabotage the survival tech program from the inside, fabricated reports, withheld resources, quiet campaigns designed to choke funding before the initiative could take root. But once the truth surfaced, the backlash was swift and fierce. Public outrage surged. News outlets seized on the revelations, airing exposés that laid bare the institutional obstacles veterans routinely faced. Eden Wolf's testimony, raw, articulate, and deeply human, became the rallying point. Under intense scrutiny and media pressure, military leadership convened an emergency summit. Eden wasn't brought in as a figurehead or symbol. She was summoned as a stakeholder, a builder of the very future they were being forced to confront. When she spoke, she didn't offer pleasantries or soft assurances. Her words cut through the room like steel. "We are not statistics, sir. We are not roadblocks to your streamlined systems. We are the backbone of this nation's defense. And if you want us to survive, you need to recognize that we matter, that we deserve respect, resources, and truth." Her message echoed well beyond the chamber's walls. It sparked not just policy reform, but a wave of renewed investment in veteran care and infrastructure across the country. At Ray's Diner, the momentum felt personal. They celebrated not with parades, but with new hires, young vets stepping into opportunities Eden had made possible. Expanded support networks began to take root, not as slogans, but as tangible acts of inclusion and trust. But the path forward was steep, and progress rarely came without resistance. One evening, Eden was wiping down a counter when a familiar voice greeted her. It was Lena Marquez, the same reporter who'd first brought her story into the public eye. Lena, notebook in hand and eyes shining with determination, pitched an idea, a documentary series dedicated to veterans whose voices had long gone unheard, a chronicle of truth, pain, and resilience. Eden hesitated. She'd never sought the spotlight, and the weight of exposure still sat heavy on her shoulders. But then she looked past her own fear, thought of all the untold stories still buried, and she gave a quiet nod. "Some stories," she said, "need to be told, not for fame, but for truth." Months later, cameras rolled, and Eden found herself sitting before a lens, not as the shy mechanic she once was, but as a woman who had sparked a movement. She spoke not for herself anymore, but for every scar concealed beneath a sleeve, every voice that had been silenced by fear or shame. This wasn't her mission alone anymore. It belonged to the many who had walked similar roads, whose stories had yet to see the light. Since Eden Wolf's story first cracked the silence, the ripples she created had swelled into something deeper, a tide of change. The survival tech program she had once championed from the shadows was no longer a fragile pilot. It had matured into a national movement, a new model for resilience, one that didn't treat vulnerability as weakness, but as strength. Everywhere Eden went, she could feel the shift. The program was no longer just about technical training. It had become a sanctuary, a place for healing the invisible wounds left by years in uniform. Her days moved in a steady rhythm: speeches, high-level meetings, mentoring sessions with new recruits, and brief pauses of stillness at Ray's, where Miguel always had a cup ready, and the hum of the diner grounded her in something real. But even as the world started to change, the old resistance hadn't disappeared. It had just learned to hide better. She encountered closed doors, passive sabotage disguised as protocol, whispered doubts about her competence. Budgets were trimmed, emails went unanswered, rumors churned beneath official smiles. The battle was no longer just with people. It was with a culture, the entrenched fear of anything that humanized a soldier, the reflex to equate silence with strength. One crisp morning, Eden arrived at base early, preparing for a high-stakes briefing with the Joint Chiefs. The room was cold and polished, the air thick with skepticism. As she stepped up to present, she read their expressions: tight lips, furrowed brows, silent judgment. But she didn't waver. She laid out the numbers, clear, irrefutable data, Better equipment, maintenance, heroism, fewer critical errors, higher retention among tech crews who had gone through the survival program. Then came the stories, first-hand accounts of lives changed, skills gained, hope restored. But when the floor opened for questions, the tone sharpened. A senior officer leaned forward, voice clipped. Sergeant Wolf, these results are impressive, but how do you answer concerns that this program is promoting a soft culture? That it undermines the discipline we depend on? Eden looked him dead in the eye. With respect, sir, true discipline comes from trust, from psychological safety. Pretending mental health doesn't matter doesn't make us stronger. It makes us brittle. What this program does is reinforce the strength we already have by acknowledging our humanity, not erasing it. Silence settled over the room. A few heads nodded. Most remained still. She didn't need their applause. She needed their change. Later that day, Eden found an anonymous message slipped beneath her office door. Printed in block letters, "Watch yourself. Not everyone wants your humanity here." She read it once, then folded the paper neatly and slid it into her jacket pocket, unshaken. The threats didn't scare her. They only reminded her that the fight mattered. That evening, she returned to Ray's diner. The window had been fixed from the vandalism 2 nights before, but the crack that once split the glass remained faintly visible, like a scar. The honor wall had grown again. New photographs, worn patches, handwritten notes from veterans across the country, testimonies, echoes of solidarity. Miguel handed her a steaming cup. "You're making waves." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ripples for now, but I aim to make a tide." And she was. The program's reach had begun to spill beyond military lines. Schools asked her to speak about trauma-informed leadership and resilience. Major corporations reached out, interested in adapting her fair to support models into their own structures. Community centers, especially in underserved areas, were integrating her frameworks to rebuild trust and self-worth. With each new request, Eden understood more clearly. This mission was never hers to keep. It belonged to everyone willing to face vulnerability head-on. At one event, after an intense panel on post-service transition, a young woman waited at the edge of the stage. She stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm Kelly," she said, voice quivering with equal parts fear and hope. "Since I left the service, I've struggled with anxiety. Some days I can barely breathe. But hearing your story, it makes me feel like maybe I'm not broken." Eden placed a firm, steady hand on her shoulder. "You're not broken, and you're not alone. We're stronger together." As seasons passed, the culture around the military shifted, slowly, sometimes painfully, but it shifted. The survival tech program was now standard in training curricula. New modules had been added: emotional intelligence, peer counseling, trauma-informed care. Commanders were reporting better unit cohesion, fewer burnout incidents, lower attrition, but Eden never let her guard down. The threats had grown louder, more aggressive. Vandalism at the diner, slashed tires, anonymous letters. She refused to flinch. Instead, she widened her network: mental health experts, advocates, lawmakers. Together, they drafted legislation designed to make veteran reintegration not just smoother, but dignified. Policy that acknowledged the full scope of what returning home meant. Not just jobs, but connection. Not just skills, but healing. In rare quiet moments, Eden would sit alone, staring at the growing wall of mementos inside Ray's. Some were photos, some were medals. Some were just names written in careful handwriting. Each one was a scar, a story, a soul still standing. One night, she lingered longer than usual after closing. The diner was still. Outside, the wind tugged at the old flag above the door. She turned to the honor wall once more. Her reflection met her gaze in the glass. The scar on her shoulder caught the dying light of dusk, not hidden, not shameful, just part of the story, a story still being written. The mission was far from complete, but hope, steadier and louder than ever, now surged through every corridor Eden walked. With the survival tech program gaining traction, Eden Wolf stepped into a new battlefield, one where the enemy wasn't only trauma or outdated systems, but the slow grind of institutional change. The foundation had been laid, yes, but now came the harder task: ensuring that resilience, recognition, and human care weren't just pilot concepts, but deeply woven into the military's culture for generations. Eden's days were packed. She moved constantly between high-stakes planning sessions, cross-disciplinary workshops, and exhausting rounds of policy development. Her work was no longer just about tools and techniques. It was about building a sustainable framework that combined technical training with robust mental health and peer support systems. She worked shoulder to shoulder with generals, psychologists, trauma specialists, and veterans themselves, shaping a model that was as practical as it was compassionate. The program grew in bold directions. New components addressed trauma-informed care, peer mentoring, and leadership development, all aimed at creating holistic support, not just operational readiness. To Eden, the emotional and psychological injuries of service deserve just as much attention as a faulty hydraulic line or a malfunctioning fuel valve. But progress invited pushback. Where there had once been subtle resistance, side eyes in meetings, silence in workshops, there were now coordinated efforts to weaken the program from within. Delayed grants, back-channel rumors, influential skeptics suggesting that the funding would be better spent elsewhere. Eden was in near constant battle with bureaucratic snags and deeply rooted mindsets. Every policy memo had to be double-proofed. Every budget meeting was a war of attrition. At one pivotal high-level meeting, Eden stood before a room of senior officials and delivered hard data, long-term trends showing reduced equipment failures, higher unit morale, stronger retention, and enhanced deployment readiness. As she spoke, the tension in the room was palpable. One general, older and stern-faced, leaned back and muttered, "Data can be interpreted in all kinds of ways. How do you justify these expenses when so many other needs go unmet?" Eden didn't flinch. "What we can't afford," she replied, her voice calm but firm, "is to ignore the resilience and well-being of our own people. This program is not just saving aircraft, it's saving lives. On the field, in the hangars, in the dark, quiet moments that follow the noise. This is about mission readiness in every sense." Her words struck a chord. Not everyone was convinced, but the tide began to shift. A few voices rose in her defense. By the end of the week, additional funding was approved. Outside the official spaces, Eden never lost sight of what mattered most. She continued returning to Ray's Diner, the symbolic and literal heart of the movement. The honor wall inside had expanded, now sprawling across entire sections. It had grown into something more than a tribute. It was a living document of courage and quiet survival. One evening, just after closing time, Eden sat across from Maria, her protege. The diner was quiet, lit only by the golden glow of the wall beside them. Maria, once shy and uncertain, now carried herself with assurance. "We're changing lives," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the wall. "One scar, one story at a time." Eden smiled and nodded. She didn't need to add anything. It was true, and more. Her story had ignited sparks far beyond the military. Across the country, veteran-led initiatives began to multiply. Support groups formed organically. Public schools piloted resilience education. Even corporations began to adopt peer mentorship models based on Eden's framework. What had started as a movement inside hangars and workshops had now spilled into classrooms, office buildings, and community centers. Eden had become a symbol, not of perfection, but of enduring strength, vulnerability, and action. Still, with impact came exposure and risk. The threats once veiled now became more brazen. Some were anonymous, others came from familiar corners. Security around Eden increased, and yet the community around her became her strongest shield. They rallied, not out of obligation, but from a shared sense of purpose. One quiet morning, as Eden stood outside the diner, watching the sun rise over the parking lot, a young man approached her hesitantly. He held a folded letter in both hands, trembling slightly. "It's from my dad," he said. "He served, but he never talked about it. Not until he saw your story. It helped him start opening up." Eden unfolded the letter. Inside were words heavy with emotion, gratitude, the pain of memory, the light of healing, and the cautious hope for something better. It was the kind of letter that reminded Eden why she had started this mission in the first place. Moments like that fueled her more than headlines or budget approvals ever could, because she knew this wasn't just about her. It was about reimagining what strength looked like. For every soldier, mechanic, medic, and family member who had ever been told to stay silent. Eden's mission was now a current pulling others forward, reshaping how society saw recovery, leadership, and endurance. As winter blanketed the city in frost, Eden stood once more at the diner's honor wall. Around her were photos, patches, poems, and names, once only memories, now emblems of growth and courage. She placed her palm against the wall. Behind each face was a story, and behind each story a future. The road ahead was still long, but something had changed. Hope was no longer fragile or hushed. It roared now, echoed in voices rising together. In Eden, scarred, steadfast, and quietly defiant, was proud to carry that song forward. The momentum Eden had sparked didn't slow. It evolved. With success came new challenges. The survival tech program was maturing. Expectations soared, scrutiny tightened, and the stakes climbed. Eden's role, once that of a mentor and advocate, now demanded she also be strategist, negotiator, and peacemaker. She had to balance the emotional needs of veterans with the rigid demands of military infrastructure. She walked a delicate line between those ready for reform and those clinging fiercely to tradition. Then came the call. One of the program's early pilot sites reported a serious incident. A technical failure during a high-risk training drill had nearly cost a flight crew their lives. The initial reports cited mechanical error, but whispers hinted at something more. Human factors, fatigue, possible miscommunication, or, disturbingly, intentional sabotage. Eden didn't hesitate. She deployed immediately. When she arrived at the base, the atmosphere was brittle. Leadership avoided eye contact. The technicians were exhausted, the air crew still visibly shaken. Eden got to work, conducting hands-on inspections, combing through maintenance logs, and sitting down for long interviews. Something wasn't adding up. The logs contained inconsistencies. Statements contradicted each other. Subtle irregularities started forming a pattern. This wasn't just carelessness. It looked like someone had tampered with the system. Eden brought in cybersecurity teams and base security. Together, they uncovered evidence of deliberate sabotage. Credentials had been compromised. Falsified data had been inserted to hide the tampering. Eventually, they identified the saboteur, a former technician discharged under reforms Eden herself had led. Bitter and vengeful, he'd found a way to lash out. The revelation sent ripples of shock through the base. Eden called a meeting and addressed the personnel directly. "This isn't just about faulty wiring or missing signatures," she told them. "This is about trust. It's a test of our resilience, of how we respond to fear and disruption. We don't just repair machines, we repair each other, and we rise together." Her words landed, the base rallied, tensions eased. The crew stood taller. Back at Ray's diner, the honor wall grew once more. New stories pinned next to the old. Stories of facing sabotage, of standing tall, of enduring. Eden threw herself into next steps. She worked with policymakers to tighten digital security, shield whistleblowers, and create clearer, safer channels for reporting concerns. And at the same time, she expanded the program's reach, now including support for military families, knowing full well that true resilience extended beyond the hangar into the home. The mission continued, and Eden Wolf, ever forward, never alone. Eden Wolf's work had grown far beyond the mechanics bay and training fields. It now reached deep into the hearts of families affected by military reintegration. She launched programs designed not only for veterans, but for their spouses and children as well, offering counseling and educational support. One evening, she sat with a circle of military spouses, mothers, partners, and caregivers whose lives were entwined with service. The air was thick with shared memories of sacrifice, moments of frustration, and fragile strands of hope. Eden listened, absorbing every word. Then she spoke gently. "Your strength is a critical part of resilience. What you do to support your loved ones is just as vital as anything we teach in the field." Her words weren't rehearsed. They were deeply felt, and they anchored her even more firmly within the community she served. As time passed, Eden and her program attracted national media attention. Features and interviews spotlighted her impact, not just on military readiness, but on the emotional well-being of veterans. But visibility brought with it a relentless pressure. Eden was tired. Her exhaustion went far beyond the physical. The emotional weight, The endless meetings and the internal battles with entrenched systems all took their toll. When she needed to breathe, she went to Ray's diner. In that familiar booth with a hot cup of coffee and quiet conversation, Eden found moments of peace. Miguel was often there, offering her space to laugh or simply sit in silence. The scar on her shoulder, once a hidden wound, had become something else entirely, a symbol of the endurance that defined her. The sabotage incident months ago had been a defining moment. The exposure of internal betrayal within the ranks might have broken trust, but instead it hardened the collective resolve of the people who believed in her. Veterans, active service members, and young recruits doubled down on the mission she had set in motion. Still, Eden knew that systemic change wasn't something you won overnight. It was a long, grinding campaign of small victories and steady resistance. Her schedule remained packed. Meetings with base leadership, sessions with mental health professionals, technical workshops. But she never let the administrative load eclipse what mattered most: personal mentorship. Maria, once uncertain and soft-spoken, had grown into a confident and driven leader. She often accompanied Eden when they met with new recruits or struggling veterans. One hot afternoon, after a particularly grueling training, Maria pulled Eden aside and spoke quietly. "Sergeant Wolf, some of the new guys are afraid to talk about what they're going through. They think it'll ruin their careers." Eden paused, her brow furrowing. "They're right to be afraid." "Yeah, she said honestly. "That fear is real, but it's also the reason we have to keep going. We have to fight for a culture where asking for help is seen as strength, not a liability." She didn't stop at words. Eden organized new workshops centered on mental health awareness, bringing in trusted psychologists and counselors who spoke plainly, without euphemism or judgment. Families were encouraged to attend. The goal was clear: break down the stigma, start the conversation, and promote early intervention before quiet suffering became a crisis. Meanwhile, partnerships with universities were beginning to bear fruit. Research teams tracked long-term results for veterans participating in resilience training, and the early data was promising. Participants showed improvements in mental health, higher job retention rates, and a renewed sense of purpose. Success stories began to circulate, stories that inspired new recruits, changed command attitudes, and built momentum for broader reform. But Eden never relaxed. Even with the praise and data behind her, some leaders still viewed her work with suspicion. In quiet meetings behind closed doors, resources were questioned, methods scrutinized, her presence labeled disruptive. She didn't flinch. She countered with hard evidence, heartfelt testimony, and the unwavering conviction that the mission mattered. One evening, back at Ray's diner, she found a letter waiting for her on the counter. The handwriting was neat but hesitant. It was from a young soldier she had never met. He thanked her, not for any personal encounter, but for the work she had done, the voice she had given to people like him. He had been at the edge, recovering from injury and drowning in silence. Her story, her courage, had reminded him that he wasn't alone. As Eden read his words, tears gathered in her eyes. Moments like this were why she kept going. As the survival tech program grew in recognition and reach, Eden began planning something larger: a national conference focused on veteran reintegration and resilience. It would bring together military leaders, policymakers, clinicians, and most importantly, veterans themselves. The planning was intense: logistics, security, speakers, schedules. But Eden knew the potential. It wasn't just a conference, it was a platform for change. In rare moments of quiet, she thought back to where it all began: a scarred mechanic trying to blend into the background. Now she was helping lead a movement that insisted no story should be buried, no wound hidden. The mission had evolved, yes, but at its core, it was still about visibility. It was about ensuring that every veteran, no matter how quiet or broken, was seen and heard. The program had become more than a tool for training. It was a catalyst for cultural transformation. And Eden's role had evolved right alongside it. She now served as an advisor to interdepartmental committees shaping national policy. She spoke at congressional hearings, advocated for laws supporting mental health access, job placement, and reintegration for veterans across the country. Her testimony held weight. When she spoke before the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs, she didn't just talk numbers. She told stories: her own, Maria's, the soldier who wrote her the letter. Every word was a reminder that behind every policy gap was a human life. Eden's impassioned testimony reverberated through the chamber. Her message was clear. Reintegration required more than technical skill. It demanded recognition of emotional scars, psychological healing, and community reintegration. Her voice helped push a shift in legislative priorities. More funding, expanded programs, a new national awareness. Back home, Ray's Diner had become something of a shrine. The honor wall now drew visitors from across the country. Veterans, families, strangers, each of them stopping to study the mosaic of faces and stories, each portrait a testament to survival. Eden still came often, sometimes just to listen to others, sometimes to be reminded of the weight and beauty of what had been built. One afternoon, a delegation from the Department of Defense arrived unannounced. They didn't come for a photo op. They came with real interest in what Eden had built. They wanted to explore the possibility of officially integrating the survival tech principles into military doctrine. The conversation was cautious, hopeful, yes, but layered with complexity. Policies don't change overnight. But the very fact that they were there, sitting across from Eden in that small diner booth, was proof of progress. And Eden Wolf, tired but unwavering, prepared herself for the next chapter, because the mission still burned strong. Eden Wolf moved through every round of negotiation and strategic planning with quiet force. She was calm, steady, but never passive. With each meeting, she brought a rare combination of diplomacy and conviction, ensuring that every policy, every proposal, and every line item served one unshakable purpose: honoring the scars of service and giving voice to every story once buried in silence. Even as the nation began to recognize her work, media coverage, awards, congressional hearings, Eden stayed rooted. The core of her mission never left her. She still worked closely with young technicians, sleeves rolled up, fingers smudged with grease. That kind of mentorship, tactile, grounded, was where she believed real change began. Maria had grown into her own, now a senior instructor in the survival tech program. She moved through the hangars with quiet confidence, teaching, leading, and embodying everything the program stood for. She wasn't just proof of its success, she was the future. At the same time, the documentary series that first spotlighted Eden's story had taken on a life of its own, spreading into classrooms and training camps. It wasn't just history, it had become curriculum, helping to shape the minds and hearts of the next generation. These stories of pain and resilience were teaching empathy. They were forming citizens and future leaders who understood that service didn't end with discharge, and that the wounds carried home deserved more than a passing glance. Still, Eden remained clear-eyed. The tide was turning, yes, but the current was slow and often unpredictable. Bureaucratic red tape, shrinking budgets, and a deep-rooted resistance to change were constant adversaries. She had to dodge political traps, deflect passive-aggressive delays, and face down efforts to quietly push her program to the sidelines. And yet, for every setback, Eden's resolve only solidified. She knew real transformation didn't happen overnight. It was slow, persistent work. Change came in inches through tough conversations, revised policies, and perhaps most importantly, through small, daily acts of compassion and courage. One quiet evening at Ray's Diner, as twilight stretched long across the windows, Eden received a message from an old comrade. A simple note, just a few lines, but it stirred something deep, the kind of connection only hardship forges. She pinned a new photograph on the honor wall that night. Another face, another story, another reminder that her journey from the shadows of the maintenance bays to the national stage had never been just about her. It had become something bigger, a movement fueled by every scar that dared to be seen, every voice that chose to speak, and every person who refused to let silence win. Following the momentum of her congressional testimony and the military's formal adoption of the survival tech program, Eden stepped into a new arena, one with broader stakes. She found herself at the center of a sweeping national effort to redefine how the military supported its veterans. This chapter demanded collaboration, bold thinking, and a willingness to break down the same walls that had once held her back. Her reach expanded far beyond the base fences. She built partnerships with nonprofits, schools, and city councils. The programs they created weren't just about job training. They offered mental health resources, family support systems, and pathways for reintegration. It wasn't a checklist, it was a lifeline, a living network designed around the real, complex lives of veterans. At a landmark national conference, Eden stood shoulder to shoulder with doctors, lawmakers, and fellow veterans. It was a turning point, an unmistakable signal that things were changing. Her keynote speech was direct, unflinching. Readiness, she said, her voice calm but commanding, is not just about weapons or machines. It's about people, their hearts, their minds, their spirits. When we fail to care for that, we don't just fail them, we fail the mission. The room fell silent. It was a truth they all knew but rarely said aloud. That moment ignited a surge of action. New legislative proposals emerged, aiming to boost funding for mental health services, open up access to education and job opportunities, and create national standards for peer-led support. Real change was no longer a distant ideal. It was moving. Back at Ray's Diner, that momentum lived in the walls. The once simple cafe had become sacred ground. The honor wall now stretched from floor to ceiling, layered with Polaroids, dog tags, faded letters, and hand-scrawled notes. Strangers came, students, families, soldiers, civilians, and left changed. Eden often led quiet circles there, guiding conversations that made space for pain, for healing, and for solidarity. One afternoon, a young veteran, nervous, eyes downcast, asked her softly, "How do you keep going when it feels like the fight never ends?" Eden looked at him, the corners of her mouth lifting into a gentle smile. "We keep going," she said, "because we have each other. Because every story told, every scar honored, is a step out of the dark." The survival tech program matured into something greater than she had ever imagined. But Eden knew that cultural change demanded more than programs. It needed education at its roots. She joined forces with curriculum designers, helping to craft materials for military academies that wove resilience training, emotional intelligence, and leadership development into every layer of instruction. Her goal was simple and radical: raise a generation of soldiers who saw strength not just in toughness, but in vulnerability. Yet, resistance remained. There were policymakers who balked at the cost, high-ranking officers who saw her work as a threat to tradition. And deep beneath it all, the old stigmas still lingered, quiet, insidious, in the minds of service members and their families. Eden met those challenges with research, persistence, and an unshakable belief in the power of testimony. She presented data showing improved unit performance when resilience training was implemented. More importantly, she shared stories, real ones, raw ones, that reminded every skeptic that behind every policy was a human life. Through it all, Ray's Diner stayed her center of gravity. The clatter of plates, the smell of coffee, the low murmur of conversations. It was a refuge, a sacred space where brokenness was welcome and healing was communal. Her presence was steady, her leadership quiet but fierce. And more, she used that influence to turn other veterans into leaders. She nurtured peer networks, seeded mentorship groups, and gave others the tools to take up the mission. One evening, after a long community discussion, Eden lingered by the window as dusk gave way to night. She watched the flickering street light reflect off the honor wall. Her heart was full but restless. The work ahead loomed large, but so did the hope it carried. This wasn't just her battle anymore. It was a shared crusade, a living movement. The scars, some visible, others not, continued to speak of pain, of sacrifice, but also of survival. Eden was determined. No voice would be lost, no story dismissed. She imagined a future where resilience wasn't an anomaly but a core value, where support was woven into the very structure of the system, and where every veteran, regardless of how or when they served, knew they were seen. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting deep shadows across the booths and coffee cups, Eden Wolf stood at the heart of something larger than herself. She wasn't just a survivor, not just a mechanic or a medic or an advocate. She was the embodiment of a movement that had dared to rewrite the rules. What began in silence and solitude had reached a breaking point and a beginning. The survival tech program would outlive her. That was the goal. Her mission had never been about glory. It was about truth. about legacy, about never again letting the quiet ones be forgotten. Tech companies to build a more unified support system for veterans transitioning to civilian life. These alliances help develop educational curricula that wove resilience and empathy into every layer, training future leaders, teachers, and employers to understand and honor the journey veterans had walked. She saw it not only as advocacy, but as a blueprint for cultural renewal. At the heart of it all was Eden Wolf. She had long stopped seeing herself as the hero of the story because she knew this story belonged to everyone. To Maria, now confidently leading resilience workshops across bases. To Jake, who'd gone on to write his own story, inspiring others at the rehab center. To Lucas, who'd grown from a quiet observer into a vocal advocate for maintenance and mental health programs. Even to young airmen like Kelly, who once struggled to find her place, but now mentored others with the same compassion Eden had shown her. Eden's work was no longer a personal mission. It had become a movement, a living, breathing network of stories, programs, and people. She was still the quiet force behind much of it, showing up to hearings, visiting field programs, answering late-night calls from recruits on the edge. But her greatest contribution was always less visible, the steady shaping of a culture where vulnerability wasn't weakness, where healing was a shared pursuit, and where no one had to carry their burdens alone. Evenings at Ray's Diner had grown quieter, but never lonely. The honor wall stretched farther now, filled with photographs both old and recent, letters yellowed with time and freshly penned notes of gratitude. Among the memories was a new photo Eden had placed, one of her standing arm in arm with Maria, Lucas, and others smiling with hard-earned pride. The image didn't speak of glory or rank. It spoke of survival, of resilience forged in fire and shaped in compassion. One evening, as a cool breeze stirred the edges of a letter tacked to the wall, Eden stood in silent reflection. Her hand brushed the photo lightly, her eyes tracing the faces of those she'd mentored and stood beside. The world outside was still full of struggle. There were still battles to fight, policies to change, minds to open. But there, in that moment, she felt a quiet peace. She knew they had already begun to reshape the world. One story, one scar, one act of courage at a time. Her voice had become one among many, but it carried the same strength. At a veteran storytelling circle, Eden listened to a young woman speak of trauma and perseverance, then stepped forward to close the evening. Her words were soft, but rang with truth. Every time we tell our story, we claim it. We take back the power. We remind the world and ourselves that we are still here, still healing, still standing. The room sat in reverent silence before erupting in applause, not just for Eden, but for themselves, for one another, for the shared promise of a future shaped not by silence, but by strength. As Eden left the diner that night, the stars glimmered overhead, mirrored in the soft lights along the walkway. She walked slowly, deliberately, her back straight, her presence grounded. The mission wasn't over. It never would be. But it no longer rested on her shoulders alone. That was the legacy she had built. Not a monument, but a living force of people, of purpose, of resilience passed forward like a flame. A torch held by countless hands. And in that glow, Eden Wolf kept walking forward, toward a dawn she had helped create, and a world forever changed by those who dared to carry their scars into the light. Eden Wolf had long moved beyond the cramped corners of military hangars and the isolated quiet of her early mechanic days, yet the work she began never left her. Through tireless collaboration with private organizations, she helped forge new pathways designed not just to educate veterans, but to reintegrate them into the workforce with purpose and dignity. These initiatives tackled the deep-rooted barriers, institutional biases, shifting political landscapes, and the stubborn weight of social stigma. Eden met each of these headwinds not with aggression, but with patient determination. She didn't need noise to make an impact. She had learned through battle and healing alike that real change often begins in silence, then grows as voices join in. Her example gave countless veterans the strength to speak, to see their scars as symbols of survival rather than shame, and to fight not just for their own future, but for the community they belong to. Her story lit the way. Maria and other protégés took up the torch, not as followers, but as leaders in their own right. They launched new programs, mentored peers, and reshaped the very culture of service and recovery. The documentary that once captured Eden's journey transformed over time. No longer just a film, it evolved into a set of teaching tools woven into the curricula of both military training centers and civilian institutions. The lessons were no longer abstract. They were lived, embedded into the way resilience and empathy were taught. From cadets in uniform to students in public high schools, people were learning that strength often came not in spite of pain, but because of it. Through it all, Eden held fast to a belief that had carried her since her earliest days in uniform. That real lasting change grows from the connection between individuals, communities, and the systems that serve them. This belief grounded her through the slow, often invisible work of advocacy. When the day finally came to reflect, to step back and see what she had built, Eden stood in awe, not of herself, but of the movement she had helped to spark. Once just a quiet mechanic concealing the aftermath of combat beneath layers of grease and silence, she had become something larger than even she could have imagined. A symbol, a voice, a movement. Her mission had taken root and bloomed in places she would never walk herself, in classrooms, in clinics, in boardrooms, on the Senate floor. It breathed in every story bravely told, in every scar no longer hidden. The road ahead remained uncertain, but it shimmered with possibility. Eden was still walking it, shoulder to shoulder, with those willing to be seen in their fullness. The years passed, and with each turn of the seasons, Eden's story became more than a tale. It became part of the living memory of a nation. It became embedded in the evolving identity of the veteran community. What started as a solitary journey of healing and survival had become a collective awakening, one that honored not just service, but humanity. The Survival Tech program, once narrowly focused, grew into a model that encompassed everything Eden knew was essential. Technical skill, yes, but also mental health support, family inclusion, and deep, enduring community connection. These principles became the foundation for new leadership across the armed forces. Leaders trained to recognize that vulnerability did not weaken strength, it refined it. At Ray's Diner, the honor wall continued to expand. It became more than a collection of keepsakes. It was a living archive of courage. The wall filled with photographs, worn patches, handwritten letters, and the tokens of lives touched by Eden's movement. Veterans came from far away to stand before it, to leave something behind, to see themselves reflected in its growing mosaic of resilience. Eden often returned there quietly. In that corner booth with a steaming mug in hand, she'd listen to the stories others shared and feel herself part of something vast, healing, and real. Beyond the diner, the ripple effect spread wide. Schools implemented new curriculum rooted in empathy, trauma literacy, and resilience training. Workplaces evolved to become more inclusive, crafting veteran-focused hiring practices and trauma-informed leadership training. Even legislation shifted, with funding, legal protections, and health services being recalibrated to meet the full scope of veterans' needs. Eden's work had become a rallying point. It stirred veterans and their families into action. It empowered advocates. It gave those silenced by shame a platform from which to speak. Her journey became a mirror held up to society, asking it to see not just the uniform, but the person within. She had taught a generation that true transformation doesn't come from denying pain, but by facing it. She reminded them, and all of us, that no one heals alone. The path she forged, often through thorns and stone, became a road walked by many. Her scars, once hidden, were now emblems of honor. And while her story began as deeply personal, it resonated because it told a truth that belonged to thousands, even millions. It was a story of unseen wounds and unrecognized strength, of families broken and rebuilt, of systems that had to be challenged to become humane. It was a call to see veterans not as problems to fix, but people to honor. The movement that Eden sparked changed how we define service, how we talk about trauma, and how we fight for dignity. Her survival tech initiative, once a mere blueprint, became a lighthouse. It guided change in military institutions and far beyond. Teachers, employers, therapists, and legislators found inspiration in it. It reshaped policy, redefined leadership, and reminded communities that healing demands connection. Ray's Diner, with its growing honor wall, stood as a symbol. It was no longer just a place to eat. It was a sacred space, a gathering ground where truth could be told and burdens laid down, a place where no one had to pretend to be whole to be worthy of respect. And still, the road wasn't smooth. Eden met resistance. She faced critics who clung to old notions of what strength looked like. Some tried to silence her, to discredit the stories that made people uncomfortable. But every attempt to suppress the truth only deepened her resolve. Every obstacle became another reason to press forward. Through it all, she held to one truth: strength lives in the willingness to be seen. And now, as the final chapter of Eden's journey settles into place, it becomes clear that hers is not simply a personal story, it is a cultural landmark. Her life illuminated the hidden corridors of suffering that often go ignored and shone a light on the quiet, daily courage it takes to keep living. Her story affirmed that healing is not linear, and that vulnerability is not weakness, but power in its rawest form. We followed Eden through war zones and hospital rooms, through silence and protest, through mentorship and transformation. We watched as her scars, physical and emotional, turned into the language of resilience. And in doing so, she gave others permission to do the same. This is more than Eden's story now. It's the story of a community, a movement, a reckoning. One built not on the myth of unshakable strength, but on the truth of perseverance. One born from pain and made powerful by connection. As Eden stood once more before the honor wall, surrounded by names and faces that formed the mosaic of her life's work, she didn't feel sorrow. She felt peace, because what she had built would not end with her. It would carry on in the hands of those who believed in healing, who dared to speak their truth, and who were unafraid to be seen. Strength, Eden had come to know, was never in the silence. It was in the voice that rose through it. The silence once held by pain now finds a voice through grace. And in this story, courage isn't something pinned to a uniform or etched into a citation. It is defined by the simple act of standing tall, of showing up, of refusing to vanish. This isn't just a tale meant to end when the screen fades to black. It's an invitation, a call carried in the marrow of anyone who's ever known someone who served, loved someone who wore the uniform, or tried to understand the weight of silence that follows those who return from war. Whether you're a veteran yourself, a spouse, a child, a friend, or simply someone who cares, your presence in this space matters. Your voice matters, so listen, not just with your ears, but with your whole heart. Hear the truth behind quiet words, behind the lines of a face weathered by memory. Speak too when others cannot. Lend your voice to those whose own are still trapped beneath the weight of grief or shame. And act, even if the step feels small. Sometimes offering a safe place, a moment of understanding, or even just listening without judgment is the kind of bravery that changes everything. When we choose to acknowledge every scar, not just the visible ones, but the ones buried beneath layers of silence, we become part of something greater. We become keepers of stories that might otherwise be forgotten. And those stories, they matter deeply. So tell us what you felt. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know where you were watching from. Let Eden's story stir something in you, not for applause, but because healing often begins with one voice saying, "I see you." If her journey has touched you, consider joining us. Subscribe to Veteran Biker. Here, we don't just tell stories, we honor them. We fight for them. We make sure they're heard. Each subscription helps grow a community that chooses empathy over silence and action over apathy. One story at a time, we move forward. And maybe the next story we share will be yours or someone you know. Because no one who has given so much should ever feel invisible. Everyone deserves to be seen, heard, and valued. Thank you for walking with us through this journey, for opening your heart, for standing beside those whose sacrifices are often unspoken but immense. Together, we can ensure these stories don't fade into shadows. We can help them shine bright and unwavering. This is Veteran Biker, where every scar is a testament, every story a light, and every voice truly matters.